Order. And welcome to meeting number 11 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations Estimates. Today the committee will be continuing its study on air defense procurement projects and its study of the National Shipbuilding Strategy. The committee will be considering each study separately. In order to keep the studies separate, we have asked each witness to make 2 statements. And to the witnesses, please remember we're asking for a 3-minute statement. And then they'll go into questions after that point. So the first hour of the committee will be studying air defense procurement projects. Each witness will make an opening statement at the start of the first hour, followed by questions. During the second hour, the committee will be studying the National Shipbuilding Strategy, and the same witnesses will make another opening statement at the start of the second hour. After that, the rest of the time will be taken up with questions by members. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the House Order of November 25, 2021, members are attending in person in the room and remotely via Zoom. Regarding the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members who are participating virtually or in person. I would like to take this opportunity to remind all participants at this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Given the ongoing pandemic situation and in light of the recommendations from public health authorities, as well as the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on October 19, 2021, to remain healthy and safe, the following is recommended. Anyone with symptoms should participate by Zoom and not attend the meeting in person. Everyone must maintain 2-meter physical distancing, whether seated or standing. Everyone must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room. It is recommended in the strongest possible terms that members wear their masks at all times, including when seated. Non-medical masks, which provide better clarity over cloth masks, are available in the room. Everyone present must maintain proper hand hygiene by using the hand sanitizer at the room entrance. Committee rooms are cleaned before and after each meeting. To maintain this, everyone is encouraged to clean the surfaces of their desk, their chair, and their microphone with the provided disinfectant wipes when vacating or when taking a seat. As the chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting, and I thank members in advance for their cooperation. I'd like to welcome the witnesses here today and invite them to make their first opening statements. We will start with Mr. Leprec. Thank you. You're on mute right now, Mr. Leprec. There you go.
Bonjour, merci de l'invitation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I will be speaking in
Opening remarks on defense procurement highlight the myriad of needlessly onerous rules to err exceedingly on the side of transparency and accountability instead of making good on getting the military the equipment that it needs. There's a trade-off between effects, that is getting the troops, the infrastructure and the equipment they need, and transparency to risk manage the procurement process, assert political control, and avoid an aggrieved bidder crying foul. Without a new significant influx of money and no immediate prospect for more staff, Parliament and government must look seriously at reducing the exceptionally onerous procedures that plague procurement and staffing processes. There are 2 options: either generate more staff and more money, or simplify the procedures that consume vast amounts of time and staff resources. Both Liberal under Chrétien and Conservative Harper governments tried to tackle the bureaucratic hurdles, but the red tape action teams got bogged down in red tape and never accomplished anything. The CAF maintains 25 bases, wings, and stations across the country. It has the largest real estate portfolio in the government of Canada, 10 million square meters of floor space, 21,000 buildings, 2.2 million hectares of land, 13,500 works that includes roads, sewers, and so forth. But due to the persistent lack of staff and financial resources, there's a consistent risk of failure. And as a result, D&D is responding to crises that cause cost increases to increase exponentially of what it would have cost to do proactive maintenance had D&D been allocated the money to do so. These are constraints imposed by central agencies, often at the behest of Parliament. D&D returned $1.2 billion last fiscal year, about 5% of its overall budget allocation. That is an indication of the mismatch between funding and procedures. In other words, an increase in funding will not necessarily fix the CAF's procurement woes, and this committee should study in depth the copious and onerous procurement requirements imposed on D&D and the CAF to examine how these can be streamlined and aligned to ensure that the procedures that enable funding allocations are more optimally matched with the effects that Parliament and government intends to generate. The committee might also look at alternative procurement models. One is to have a dedicated Minister of Defence Industry, as in Australia, to ensure better political attention and expertise, which is necessarily spread thin for a single minister who is responsible for the single largest organizational employer in Canada that makes up about a quarter of federal government and direct spending. And the committee should also examine alternative procurement models, such as the Swiss approach of voting a budget envelope for defence procurement on a particular issue to that particular effect, but then defer to defence and government procedural mechanisms to decide on what effect to procure with that envelope. Thank you.
Go to Mr. Perry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the members for the invitation to appear today to talk about some of Canada's air defence procurements. I think I wanted to start by noting that we've made some good and noticeable progress lately on several of these. Most recently yesterday, where for the second time in 12 years, we've announced that we'll buy the F-35. And I hope that this time that announcement actually results in the purchase of new fighter aircraft. Beyond that, and as well as some other projects related to remotely piloted air systems, surveillance aircraft, and aerial refueling and transport planes, there's momentum behind some of our procurements, and I hope that the Minister of National Defence's public statements about the modernization of continental defense, she says will start to occur shortly, will further enhance our air defenses if those move forward. While this will all strengthen our defense collectively, these initiatives I think could benefit from three improvements: greater prioritization of defense procurement, an increase in our procurement systems capacity, and a more rigorous approach to scheduling. Given the complexity of defense procurement and the multiple competing government objectives that have to be reconciled within it, procurements will move quickest when governments clearly care about the speed of equipment delivery and make that a high priority. When that has been the case, major procurements have moved fast, such as when we acquired transport aircraft and equipment for the war in Afghanistan in the late 2000s. Absent clear prioritization from the Prime Minister and Cabinet down into the bureaucracy and military, however, projects will move slower than they could otherwise. At present, it does not appear that defense procurement is a key Government of Canada priority. The capacity of the procurement system also needs to be better calibrated with the volume of procurement projects Canada is currently pursuing. The procurement workforce was downsized during program review in the 1990s and has never been fully rebuilt to the same size. To cite one example, the Materiel Group at D&D is only a little bit more than half as big as it was at the end of the 1990s, despite working with roughly the same amount of money adjusted for inflation today as it did then. This mismatch between capacity and workload will be a key limiting factor in any attempt to accelerate the pace of air defense procurement projects or increase defense spending, including through the modernization of continental defense. And finally, our procurement efforts could be strengthened by improving the rigor with which defense procurement project schedules are established. Too many of them appear to be set simply by starting from the date a new piece of equipment is desired and then working backwards without any regard for the actual feasibility of completing the required work in the allotted time frame. Failing to account for the expected complexity and risk involved in a project and the corresponding time it takes to complete dooms projects to fail to live up to expectations from the onset and virtually guarantees their budgets will be eroded by the impact of inflation over time. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And now, again, to Mr. Williams, 3 minutes. Thank you, please. Mr. Williams, you're on mute. Thank you. You're good now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Pleasure to be here and to talk to you about these matters. I'd like to, though, begin by making a comment about the tragedy currently unfolding in Ukraine. We have a moral obligation to step forward and do our part in addressing the violence taking place now. In all likelihood, going forward, we'll find ourselves in a similar position elsewhere in the world. To do our part, though, we can't continue to squander precious time and resources through abhorrent procurement practices that are in full display in our attempts to acquire new fighter jets and new ships. I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about how to fix defense procurement for a moment or two, and then some comments on the recent decision to acquire the F-35s. For over a decade, I've been a fervent advocate for the need to establish one point of accountability. Christian mentioned this in his comments. Quite simply, there's excessive overlap and duplication between the roles of the Minister of National Defense and the Minister of Public Service and Procurement in Canada. Unless and until one minister is placed in charge of defense procurement, it will never be as efficient, as effective as it could be. Amongst our close allies, Canada stands alone with the system of dispersed accountability. The United States, the Secretary of Defense, is accountable for military procurement. The United Kingdom, the responsibility falls to the UK Secretary of State for Defense. In Australia, defense procurement is under the authority of the Defense Material Organization, accountable to the Minister of Defense. In December 2019, I was encouraged that the government was finally going to act on this recommendation. The mandate letters at the time for the Minister of National Defense and Public Service and Procurement Canada included a directive to bring forward options for the creation of a new single entity, Defense Procurement Canada. Sadly, my hopes were dashed when the December 2021 mandate letters to these two ministers no longer reference this matter. I recognize that addressing this governance issue will not solve all the procurement problems, but it is a necessary first step. The benefits of creating a single procurement organization go beyond strengthening accountability. First, the process would also be streamlined. At the present time, the process only moves as fast as the slower the two organizations permit. The result is that many months can be lost due to briefings and approvals through multiple organizations. Second, savings will emerge from the elimination of overhead and duplication of functions through the merging of PSPC and D&D resources. These savings can help mitigate the impact of the significant staff cutbacks over the past 2 decades. Third, until one minister is vested with overall accountability for defense procurement, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to introduce system-wide performance measures. With respect to performance measures, famed management guru Peter Drucker once said, any government, whether that of a company or of a nation, degenerates into mediocrity and malperformance, it is not clearly accountable for results. Without performance measures open to public scrutiny, performance suffers. We need indicators that are minimum, measure costs and timeliness. Costs are rising, why are they rising? If delays are occurring, where in the process are the bottlenecks? It is impossible to make improvements if we don't have a clear understanding as to where the problems lie. Finally, we need a capital plan with the following attributes. First, it must be fully costed, a long-term plan. The Department of National Defense's Defense Investment Plan is a weak and inadequate attempt to meet this need. It lacks sufficient granularity to be effective. The costing debacle of the CSC proves this point. Until the Defense Investment Plan, unlike the defense investment, the full life cycle cost for each project should be displayed over a 30-year period and mapped against the projected available funds year by year. Second, it requires cabinet approval. Cabinet approval makes it more difficult for governments to change priorities for partisan political purposes. Third, it needs to be made public. The benefits of such a public plan would be far-reaching. From a public information standpoint, all Canadians would have a better understanding of what and how their money is being spent. Parliament committees like yours could more readily provide rigorous oversight over these billions of dollars of expenditures. Lastly, knowing that this plan is less likely to be modified, potential suppliers will more readily take the necessary time to position themselves in an optimum position to compete at the appropriate time. One last, with regard to the recent announcement, I do have a couple of concerns. The first with respect to the
Excuse me, apologize for interrupting you, Mr. Williams. And unfortunately, due to time, perhaps you can get what you're trying to say there in maybe some of your answers. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will now start with our first round and go with Mr. Paul Hughes for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being here with us. My first question, we heard the news about the pre-selection for the F-35s. What we understand is that the F-35 was not really officially selected or chosen. The government still has to engage in dialogue. So, Mr. Williams, on your side, what is your understanding of what this dialogue is all about? Over the next few months, they are talking about the possibility of 7 months of dialogue.
Well, in fact, I was going to comment that I have two big concerns about the announcement. The first is that simply making statements that it's 19 billion is inadequate. It's important for the committee to know, is this the acquisition cost? Is this a long-term support cost, long-term maintenance cost? We have seen over and over again cost estimates that are unbelievably low, that misleads both parliamentary committees and the public. The second, I was quite shocked, frankly, to hear that negotiations would be taking 7+ months. Typically, when you run a competition, all the terms and conditions are specified in that proposal. And to respond, you have to have met all of the conditions. 7 months is an awfully long time, and I get concerned when I hear that kind of information. Interestingly enough, when we purchased the cormorants, it took 3+ months. When we bought the maritime helicopters, it took about 4 months. That, in my experience, is typical the amount of time it takes. There shouldn't be a lot of nuance, not if they responded favorably and appropriately to all the terms and conditions.
Okay.
We also understand that in yesterday's announcement, the ADM, Mr. Page, mentioned that if during dialogue with Macro, there's any obstacle, the government would choose someone else. We have two options. If it doesn't work with the F-35s, we kill Martin, Lockheed Martin, we'll go with another person. So what happens if they go on with dialogue with SAP and it doesn't work? Are we going to turn to someone else?
I don't know if the question is directed to me, but I was having a very difficult time. I'm getting the English translation over the French simultaneously. And it's very difficult to disassociate the two to understand the question. So I don't know how to turn off the French and only hear the English. I don't know if that's only my problem or if it's a problem for other people too.
We're just going to check this out for a second, and I've so just if you bear with us for a second there, Mr. Williams.
It's not on our end. He's on the web version. I'm not sure what he has selected. All right. I'm listening to translation, and
Okay. Hi, Mr. Williams. This is the clerk of the committee. We're not indicating any problems on our side in terms of the translation. It's coming through the right channels. I wonder if what you've selected, if you've selected the either the English or the French translation or the floor channel.
Okay, that might be better. I'm not sure I can. I think I can hear better, so I apologize, but perhaps the question could be rephrased if it was directed to me.
Do we need to test again? Can you hear us well now?
Still hearing the French at the same time.
As you've logged in through the web, there's nothing we can do. It's not the problem. Doesn't appear to be coming from our side, Mr. Williams. It appears to be coming from actually the website. I'm not quite sure how to rectify that, unfortunately.
Okay, so I guess if the question is going to be in French, I'll try to hear it in French.
As a question in English, I will try to help you. So my question is about the dialogue with Lockheed Martin. So after 7 months or 6 months, if government said, "Oh, we're not happy with the answer we received from Lockheed," so yesterday, Deputy Minister Page said that they will switch to SAB. So what will happen if the dialogue with SAB doesn't work? This is the question.
First of all, I have to tell you, the odds of it not working out are infinitely small. I mean, you don't go to this stage, so I wouldn't put a high likelihood of that happening. There's too much money at stake, and the terms and conditions are so specified that I'd be shocked if it wasn't given to Lockheed Martin. And frankly, it should be given a lot sooner if the thing was done right. But from a process standpoint, you're quite right. The government has the option of go to the other successful bidder in terms of not being ruled non-compliant. There were 2 bids, and it can go and see if it can work out a deal with that company. If it can't, it has to start from scratch.
Thank you. I have another question for you. It's about the in your memoir, you wrote that okay, it's in French on my sheet, but I'll translate. You said we can continue to waste precious resources and the time, and
Yes.
you're using in French. You said pratique d'approvisionnement odieuse. The odieuse is very strong. What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. Well, frankly, you can look at the two programs we're going to be talking about today and frankly be disgusted. Here we are talking about 12 years before we've got our planes. Christian mentioned that. There was no reason 12 years ago on July 16th, 2010 to bypass all proper process and announce we're sole sourcing for a jet. One does not spend billions of dollars of taxpayers' money on the say-so of someone. The way to make sure that the military knows what they need is to run a competition. In 2010, nobody had any idea what this thing would finally cost or even what it could do. To suggest that we should sole source at the time was an abomination. Those things should not happen. And if they did not happen, then at the appropriate time, because these were going to be replaced by 2018-19, you go ahead and you run the competition in advance and you get what you need in an appropriate time frame.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to make one comment about, okay.
I don't have a lot of time. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on time frames. In the year 2000, I did a study that showed that it was taking nearly 16 years to do a procurement. Myself and the vice chief at the time, George MacDonald, agreed that this is unacceptable. And we set a directive to the men and women in D&D that work on procurements to say that from now on, the military has 2 years from the beginning of time when it needs something till the time it finalizes statement of requirements. It has 2 years, and I, the civilian side, have 2 years to get it into contract. And in fact, according to the department's own information in 2011, they reported that we were successful in doing that. Unfortunately,
Thank
5
you,
or 6
Mr.
years
Williams.
later,
Sorry for interrupting. Ms. Williams, if there is something further that you would like to add to answering that question, if you could submit that in writing to the clerk, we would make certain that we share that with the committee. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Johari for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all our witnesses today. I thank you for your testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Perry. Acknowledging that your opening remark was focused on procurement, I'd like to actually focus on another aspect, and that's an investment, and that's an area that you've also been vocal in, and specifically on NORAD and NORAD modernization. I'm hoping that you are comfortable answering some question on that front. Acknowledging that NORAD is a system of systems, and the fact that for its modernization, there are two schools of thoughts or multiple venues for modernization. Would you be comfortable making comment around these venues, and which one would you recommend?
Thank you for that. I think that there's a lot of different options being considered as part of that modernization of both NORAD and a wider set of efforts around continental defense. I hope that we're going to see something quite soon. There's what was laid out in the letter between the Minister of National Defense at the time and the Secretary of Defense from the United States the day before our last federal election, I think kind of covered the waterfront, both literally and figuratively, in terms of what kinds of options Canada could contribute towards, along with the United States. A range of things from enhancing our Arctic infrastructure, improving the functionality of our forward operating locations, potentially putting one further north as an example, replacing the North Warning System with a range of modern systems to do, with today's technology, provide the same function that the North Warning System provided before, which is be able to detect the key threats coming towards North America. And I think there's a number of other investments we should look at in terms of command and control, and various things like aerial refueling tankers. Hopefully that gets at some of what
Thank you. If I be a bit more specific, I know we have an option of modernize with the focus of upgrading and defense. as well as modernizing and expanding, which gets us not only to the defense side, but also to the offense side. What are your thoughts on that? Where would you suggest we focus on?
I think we need to look at doing both. We need a better understanding of what's coming towards North America, and we need better abilities to actually respond in the circumstances in which we want to respond. And that would be across all the different domains of warfare.
Okay, thank you. So when if you're saying it's got to be a model that it's focusing on offense as well as building, enhancing our defense, where do you see the recent acquisition, or at least the announcement around the 88 F-35? How do you feel that it fits into the NORAD, both from an upgrade on our defense side as well as enhancing our offense ability?
I think that's a significant investment that'll make a really meaningful increase in our ability to contribute to the defense of the continent. I hope that project is prioritized as much as can be done. Hopefully, we can look at some options for potentially getting early delivery, but that airframe in particular will really significantly enhance both our quantitative ability to respond, as well as make several step changes in terms of the attributes of that aircraft and how much of an advancement they are over the existing fighter aircraft that we fly today.
Thank you. Given the fact that F-35s are already being used as part of the NATO with U.S., in the fact that we may be in a position, as you said, with the hope of expediting the process, be in a position to benefit from that, how will that further strengthen NORAD?
It'll strengthen NORAD by providing us with a significant increase in the surveillance capacity of our fighter aircraft, as well as a much improved ability to be able to work with other airplanes, as well as other assets either on the ground potentially or at sea, to be able to share information, pass it back and forth between different platforms to get a better sense of what's happening overall. And it also provides a significant increase in our ability to potentially intercept either an aircraft or a missile coming towards North America and shoot it down.
I want to go back to the defense as well as the offense. Now we know that traditionally the NORAD, as it is in the U.S., it's focusing on higher altitude planes or missile. Some of the new development around hypersonics by other states. Where do you think NORAD from an offense and defense got to enhance, and should it look at a much more increase the scope of including land or including sea into this consideration?
To tackle the last part of that first, I think the enhancement of our continental defense should definitely look at those aspects, both particularly at sea. I'm a little bit less clear about what the driving imperative is on land, but certainly in the maritime environment, I think that we should be working as close as we can with our American allies to make sure that the coastal approaches to North America are well secured. There's a discussion to have about who's best placed to do that, but I think the important part is that we make sure that we have the means to do that, which would require us moving quickly on our shipbuilding procurements. In terms of the hypersonic issue, I think two parts. One, we have to have enough surveillance to be able to accurately track those particular missiles, which means that we need a much more sophisticated and comprehensive ability that can pick up that fast-moving and maneuverable potential threat, and then look at ways of being able to intercept at least those weapons if we think that they're armed with conventional warheads. There's a bit of a deterrence issue that comes into play if they're nuclear armed, but they aren't always, at least as they're envisioned to be employed by some of the people that are fielding them, and we need a better ability to be able to intercept them if we think we need to.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. We'll now go to Mrs. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Williams, I hope you can hear me well now, that there's no problem with hearing two things at the same time. Let me know if you can hear me well. I can hear you, but I can still hear the French and the English. I will try to speak slowly in that case. Mr. Williams, you talked about administrative bottlenecks, and you also added the fact that there should be specialists for procurement, particularly naval procurements, to be able to carry out audits and controls. As far as you know, do we have such people within the Federal Public Service? I can say that when I was at D&D, I didn't find any problem finding people who could carry out tasks for the department.
Are a shortage of competence, whether it be in the Army, Navy, or Air Force, to help us work with industry and with our colleague departments to get the job done. I have a lot of admiration for the people that were in the ADM MAT organization and in the respective environmental organizations.
Je vais préciser un peu.
Let me clarify. I'm sorry for interrupting you. Let me clarify my question. I would like to know if within the public service there are people who know enough to be able to say these prices we're hearing for this segment of the contract are very high, considering the market trends and so on and so forth, because Lockheed Martin was the sole provider at the beginning, and then there were changes, and then we are coming back to Lockheed Martin in a process where we have two competitors, but it seemed to have been a sole contractor at the beginning. Is there any danger associated with that? A danger with seeing prices explode. So within the public service, do we have people who sufficiently master the domain to make sure that prices do not explode as we see in other domains and on other topics?
I have no problem in the same company being successful in different competitions. Good for them if they can beat the competition open, fairly, and transparently. But I would argue that that's not the case that I think we're talking about. It appears to me that they did that on the F-35. But as we'll get to talk about the Canadian service combatants, we might have a vigorous discussion and debate over that. But I would argue that in that case, the government abdicated its accountability for the program, offloaded it to the private sector, and let the private sector choose the companies with which it wanted to work. And frankly, in this particular case, I don't think anybody in this room or anybody in an industry was shocked and surprised to see when Irving's picked Lockheed Martin. They were doing business with them for many years. They had a good relationship. And frankly, if I were in charge of Irving, I probably would have done the same thing. So, but that is a totally different case about how Lockheed Martin got to be chosen from my perspective. Others may differ on that. But in principle, every competition is separate, and I have no trouble with a good company winning more than its share.
Pardon. Merci.
Thank you. Still concerning the F-35s, I don't know which of you can really give me the information I need. The American publication, I think it's Mr. Perry, the American publication of Sun's News said in an article published in June 2021, saying that the F-35 still had 7 technical deficiencies to be corrected, and those deficiencies have not been identified. So, as a potential buyer, shouldn't we know what those 7 deficiencies are and the consequences that could have on the sustainability and operationality of those planes, operability rather, of those planes?
So I think that we should have a good understanding. I think that from what I understand, that would be one of the things that could potentially come up as part of this finalization process. that will take some time, some additional months before we get to the point where we're potentially actually buying the aircraft. I think it is important to keep in mind that with a lot of these airplanes, they're in continuous upgrades basically because they're effectively flying supercomputers. And because of that, there's software that's continuously being updated. And as that happens, you have to add additional features and make sure all of that works on an ongoing basis. And this aircraft has only been in production for a little over a decade. I think actually one of the benefits of buying it now that we wouldn't have realized had we bought it earlier, the last time we decided to buy the airplane. Currently, there are more of these issues that have been resolved and worked out than there were 12 years ago.
And we'll now go to Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your testimony. We know Canada's men and women in the armed forces deserve the best equipment and support possible to carry out the difficult and dangerous work we continue to ask them to do. Maybe, Mr. Perry, you can start. Can you talk about how the choice of the F-35 ensures the safety of our men and women?
So I'd start by saying that buying a new airplane that was built this century would have been an improvement over the ones that we're flying now, given the age of the systems and everything that goes into it. So again, I hope that we move quickly to actually start acquiring airplanes quickly. The F-35 is basically the most advanced fighter jet that's been on the market available to us. It's operated by many of our close allies, so we'll be able to benefit from their experiences flying that airplane. We'll be able to work with them in as seamless a way as we could operating a fighter aircraft. And that plane will come with a whole range of very advanced, very modern technology for sensing, as well as communicating between different platforms. And I think all of those are going to have it provide to us a significant increase in our aerial firepower.
Given that 55% of our jets are serviceable only right now, according to the department, and 45% are currently grounded, and the advancing age of the fleet, obviously comes with higher maintenance costs. The Minister of Defense stated the first delivery of jets will happen in 2025. Can you speak maybe about the delay and that the government is asking our men and women to put themselves in greater danger? How much longer can we expect our men and women to do this work without significant and potentially deadly consequences?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that one of the key things that our Air Force focuses on is flight safety. So we try to minimize the risk and to ensure that we're only putting safe airplanes into the sky. But I think that the basic point that you're getting at is that when you've got aircraft that are trending towards 50, it takes a lot more effort to keep them serviceable. You can do it. Canada's unfortunately shown that we can keep very old pieces of equipment serviceable for decades past their appropriate service life. It's just a function of how much time, effort, and money you have to put in to keep doing that. And we'll have to put more in as they get older.
The Liberals in 2015 campaigned against the F-35 to find a solution to better match the country's defense needs. Now that the F-35 is the front runner again, well, it's been now chosen. What's changed?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I think it went through a competitive process, which I do think has changed some of the trust and confidence we can have in the selection of the aircraft. I think what happened in between 2010 and 2014 with the F-35, fundamentally, there was a significant loss of trust in that procurement, as well as in defense procurement writ large. Depending on how this current iteration of the process plays out, I hope that restores significant trust in the process. So that's different. And it's also a different airplane. It's had 12 years to mature and evolve.
So, okay. What about the measurable economic benefits of being a level 3 partner in all these years? Can you speak about that and what will be the benefit in the future?
So as part of the bid, we had to commit to, we have arrangements that were unique because we were in a partnership agreement, which came with certain rules that precluded us buying that aircraft through the partnership agreement. And we could have made a decision to leave it and ask for bids in that mechanism, but we didn't. But that set parameters around how the economic benefits could be realized. So we basically have opportunity to win work over the long term. I think we did miss out effectively on an opportunity for more work had we decided to buy it earlier, because I think a lot of the decisions about fleet-wide sustainment were taken years ago by the partners that had actually at that point decided to purchase the aircraft, which again, we still have not yet to this day.
So yeah, you've heard us speak about obviously calling on the government to use a made in Canada approach for replacing our aging jets and ensuring that those jets are secured, have the ability to operate across Canada's geography, especially the Arctic, which you touched on. Any procurement really needs to have much needed jobs in the Canadian aerospace industry, especially in Winnipeg and Montreal. Can you see, what kind of jobs might be created in this bid?
So, all three of the original entrants and certainly the final two had a large package of potential economic benefits distributed across the country that was all going to provide different types of specific programs and incentives. I think that had we gone any particular route, we would have received a massive injection of economic benefit from this procurement. The one with F-35 is particularly unique because it emphasizes participation in a global fleet of defense products. The other options would have had also huge employment and economic growth potential, just distributed in different ways.
Okay, what about they've announced a fighter jet that doesn't have Arctic capability, and what are the capabilities, do you believe, for the F-35s in the Arctic?
So I think there's several Arctic nations that have already purchased this aircraft. Okay. The United States, they're flown in Alaska, based in Alaska. Norway flies them. Finland is purchasing them. So it's operated by other countries that operate them in Arctic environments. So we will definitely not be alone in that.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
Seconds.
Okay, I'll get you in the next round. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now go to our second round, starting with Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes.
Great. Welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Lopresh, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, I just want to chat with you a bit. You commented about the government seems to focus too much on transparency and accountability at the expense of getting stuff done. We've actually, I think in this committee over the last 6.5 years, have seen kind of the opposite of that. We've had to fight for transparency. Even just last week we had PSPC and Coast Guard, and we could not get a straight answer on a wide range of issues. Do you really think that the government is sacrificing productivity to be over-transparent and accountable? Or did I misread your comments?
Well, we live in a democracy, and so inherently transparency, accountability, governance are critical components of the legitimacy of the institutions that we have. Whether you can get the answers you're looking for out of departments is a very different conversation than the rules that, in particular, Parliament imposes effectively on various government entities, and in particular, the Department of National Defense, given that it has basically a quarter of direct government spending. Terms of, and those rules are imposed by central agencies.
How much of the problems we have in procurement goes back to you talk about risk management. There seems to be a lot more of a focus on a CYA attitude than getting stuff done and being accountable to taxpayers or to the military to get equipment purchased.
So the more Parliament and government focuses as central agencies to have careful, very super onerous transparency and accountability mechanisms, the more it also discourages decision-making at lower levels within the department. And so because nobody wants to take a risk, so they push up that risk. So that means you also necessarily bureaucratize the entire decision-making process through the entire hierarchy of the department, precisely because civil servants will become significantly risk averse. And there are trade-offs that government needs to make, and government needs to ask whether, for instance, we have the trade-offs right with the effects that government is looking for versus what it is actually receiving.
I don't think the government's asking those questions. I think it's the bureaucrats who are making the decisions on the trade-offs. Mr. Perry, would you like to comment on the transparency and accountability part?
So I'd have to disagree significantly with my colleague about the transparency aspect. I think we're actually at a low point in the recent years in terms of transparency around procurement, and that committees like this remain one of the few venues by which government and government officials actually communicate about what's happening on multiple tens of billions of dollars worth of taxpayer investments. During the pandemic, I've seen things like updates to the Defense Capability Blueprint, which have been touted as a transparency exercise, effectively stopped for reasons that I don't really understand, because you can do web editing from home, as far as I can understand.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. I think we've been, well, actually in this committee, we've been trying to get this study going for 6.5 years now, and we're finally going to get done. And, you know, when we had Coast Guard and PSBC and so far, and every question is met with, well, COVID, you know, why is the delay COVID, and so on. Question to yourself, Mr. Perry, and then Mr. Williams, is the issue of the offsets or the ITB. How much is that actually costing Canadians, perhaps taxpayers? How much less equipment are we getting to our military? Because we seem to have much more of a focus on ITB and perhaps votes in area than delivering the best equipment to our military at the best price for our taxpayers.
So I think the short answer is that we don't really know. I think basically officially we assume that the answer is that there's no cost. I don't think that that's actually a valid representation of what's involved in providing that kind of benefit. I do think, though, that we should probably look at it from a net benefit point of view, that if there are costs, you also get a benefit in terms of economic productivity, and weigh that against whatever it might cost in terms of the aircraft to provide a full assessment about what we actually get out of that program, instead of just looking at the potential percentage points that you lose by requiring those types of investments.
Right. Mr. Williams?
Yeah, I would make a few comments. First of all, David's exactly, we don't know. I'm not sure we really want to know, but I will say this, that that's the way the game is played around the world. And I'm not so sure we would want to do a disservice to our industry relative to what's going on everywhere else. But I will make this point, that the change in how we use ITBs to select a winning bidder is to me completely flawed. As you are aware, the old industrial regional benefit structure basically said any winning bid is going to be decided by the technical bid and the price. Every company would have to submit an industrial plan that was rated pass-fail. Everybody knew how to play the game, and nobody failed the industrial plan. What we've done now, though, and we've seen it in the F-35 competition, is now we've assigned up to 20% to ITBs. Now, it didn't happen in this case, but I would say that there is a high risk going forward if you put this much weight on industrial benefits. If you basically are saying that we will be sacrificing optimum solutions for theoretical jobs in the future. Now, I'm putting on my former
Excuse me,
ADM
Mr. Williams.
Mr.
Williams, I apologize again for interrupting you, and unfortunately, due to time. So if there is further response that you feel you can add to that, please submit that to the clerk in writing. I appreciate that. We'll now go to Mr. Kazmierczuk for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate the opportunity today to ask a few questions of Professor Luprecht, whose book Spheres of Governance, actually co-edited with Professor Lazar, really influenced my thinking around multi-level governance. So really was looking forward to this exchange. In a 2016 Toronto Star article, Professor, you talked about the Danish fighter jet procurement process, and you stated then that, quote, which jet Canada buys and how many is secondary to having a proper process. And we heard today the testimony from Mr. Williams, who called the sole source procurement process that took place under the previous government as an abomination. We heard Mr. Perry talk about the lack of trust that defined that particular procurement process of the previous government. Can you tell us, in your opinion, why a transparent and independent procurement process for these fighter jets is important?
Because I think on any procurement, you have three objectives. You want to make sure you get what you're buying for, you get it on time, on budget, and with the capabilities that you need. And it seems in this country, we have great difficulties doing any of those three with the procurements that we ask for. let alone getting all three of those right. And so that, I think a proper process can get us much closer in hitting, hopefully, all three of those targets.
What's the benefit of having a competitive process as opposed to a sole source, which was the model that was used by the previous government?
I think aside from the outcomes that we might get in a market situation, there's an important component of legitimacy to a proper competitive process. And I think my colleagues alluded to the fact that considerable damage has been done to, I think, Canadians' credibility, to the credibility of the procurement process, and the confidence that Canadians have in that process. I do think that perhaps too much of the blame is frequently assigned to the department, the armed forces, and the civil servants, and not enough blame is accepted by the politicians who ultimately make the decisions, as well as the opposition that tries to score political points on procurement.
Switching gears a little bit, you've written quite a lot about Canada's support for the mission in Latvia, specifically NATO's enhanced forward presence. And I want to just ask you, what do you see will be the benefits of having these 88 fighter jets delivered in the future in general for Canada, but specifically, how do you see this new capability, if at all, playing any role in or supporting or impacting Canada's role in NATO's enhanced forward presence?
As I've remarked repeatedly in recent weeks, we can talk about deterrence, but that actually, for instance, involves having a fighter jet that can defeat Russian air defenses. And the F-35 is the one plane that can actually perform on that particular metric. So in terms of military deterrence, it goes a long way. I would also say, however, to deploy these planes effectively, we need to understand we are not first and foremost buying a plane. I think David alluded to this. We are buying a data platform because, as we know, in the 21st century, warfare is first and foremost about data and about data flows. And there's significant modernization that is required within the department, both on the network side, and government has not foreseen additional investments in networks. And so we're starting to tread water and will quickly start falling behind, as well as in the capacity of the department to have a data strategy and to digitize the entire department. So the F-35 is talking about the fighter capability is one component of a much broader conversation to which we still need to paying close attention.
Thank you. And I wanted to just switch gears one final time to economic benefits. There's well over 100 companies, Canadian companies, that have benefited from the F-35 program. And when we're talking about economic opportunity, we're not just talking about a piece of the pie for the building of the 88 Royal Canadian Air Force contract. We're talking about a piece of the pie to build, service, and supply the thousands of F-35s that are expected to be built and fly in North America over the next 20, 30 years. This was something that Mr. Perry, I believe, alluded to as well, too. Can you just talk a little bit about the economic benefits to the country and speaking from your experience, perhaps from looking at other procurement programs?
As my defense economics colleague, Ugan Burkak, would likely tell you, there's no methodology to actually measure these particular benefits that is broadly accepted by defense economists. So the benefits are whatever we say that they are. I would say that the investment in the benefits should primarily be in ensuring that Canada, building capacity for Canada to become and to maintain a high-tech defense technology capability, rather than how many jobs we might be able to provide in any one particular riding, because that is ultimately the sustainable component. So seeing ITBs as an investment in sustainability for Canadian industry more broadly, rather than for benefits that might accrue to any one riding.
Great. Now we'll go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to what you have just said, Mr. Perry. A while ago, Mr. Williams said that Canada's participation by these companies wasn't tied to a purchase obligation. Given that, ultimately, if Canada were to decide to go with Gripen or any other aircraft, what would happen to the hundreds of Canadian companies? Will the F-35 still be a partner of that consortium?
So from my understanding, the Canadian companies would essentially have lost the work. The program that governed that was called an industrial participation program. And if Canada had stopped participating in the program by indicating we weren't going to buy the airplane, that we would have lost the participation from the companies, because that work share was open to people that were intending to buy the plane. And I think basically we have had a spot held for us essentially, so long as we remained a partner and the F-35 was still a potential selection by Canada. But if we'd have gone in another direction, I don't see why we would have expected to continue getting that work.
Okay. Yeah, I would just I would just maybe add one comment. That's exactly correct. I signed into the agreement, so David's exactly right. Having said that, when it comes to ITBs, one would be shocked if the Gripen were not providing significantly more ITBs for Canada. Now, you could argue that they're not the same kind of ITBs and that kind of a thing. But the F-35 program is constrained in that it can't guarantee ITBs, whereas Gripen, and if Boeing was there, they could guarantee equal to the value of the contract.
Merci.
Thank you. Very quickly, the F-35 are not the same as the F-18s, so maybe for landing, it could be difficult. So maybe the designs of our carriers will be changed to be able to handle the F-35s.
Ms. Vignola. We'll now go to Mr. Johns for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the advantages of the F-35 is the upgradability and interoperability. Can you, Mr. Perry, you talked about these big computers and that's what they really are. Can you talk about some of these upgrades and how they also, can you speak about how they make us dependent on other countries, and, you know, will there be a bill? Like what does it look like from Lockheed every year for software, and also how can Canadians be involved in this?
So in terms of the bill, I'm not sure that we really know the answer to that. I think the way that the program's set up is that because there's a large membership, all the different members will basically pay a percentage based on the size of their fleet. But that's a percentage that we're not really sure what the denominator is in that equation. There's a pace of rapid rollouts of new block upgrades, new enhancements to the software that runs the aircraft, the avionics. My understanding is that basically is designed to keep moving in perpetuity so that the aircraft is continually upgraded. While we don't know the specific cost, I think one thing that we do benefit from is that we are a relatively small chunk of a very big fleet, including the bulk of the American Air Force's R&D investment in tactical fighters.
You know, what will the role of the aerospace engineering test establishment and other similar groups be with the F-35? And maybe you can cite on what are some Canadian specific problems that might need to be addressed by in-house engineering, and also like who trains our support personnel? Will they be civilian or military? And what is the critical path in getting these aircraft operational, like in terms of equipment, pilots, and maintenance?
So to be specific, I don't actually know with good fidelity the answers to all those questions, but those are certainly good ones to invite government officials the next time they're back before you.
Okay. In terms of Canadian procurement, why are we so efficient compared to other countries?
Did you say efficient?
Inefficient.
Oh, I think that there's a lot of different reasons. There's many different aspects of our procurement system that are different. I think it's difficult to look for examples where we are buying literally the same thing. The F-35 actually is one example where we are, but in a lot of cases, even small differences in terms of the specific features you want in a vehicle or an aircraft or a ship can make it quite different in terms of how you actually go about buying it. So making those types of international comparisons is pretty tricky without doing a real apples to apples comparison.
Okay, thank you.
Barry. We'll now go to Mr. Lobb for 5 minutes.
Chair, and thank you for everybody appearing today and providing some good information. I asked at our last meeting, I had a question. I asked one of the members on the panel just a list of different, I guess you'd call it surface-to-air defense systems. I mentioned the Switchblade, Stinger, Javelin. And the reason why I mentioned those was just because you see it in the news and so forth about what the United States is contributing to Ukraine and what they're trying to use in their own defense capabilities. And each one I mentioned, they said we have zero. And I asked if we were buying some, if any, whether for our own or to support Ukraine. And they said that's a private issue and they couldn't disclose that, which is fine. I guess that's their own prerogative. But what are your thoughts on just those ones I've mentioned, the Switchblade, Stinger, and Javelin? Would any of those make sense in our own domestic air defense capabilities, or is that just for the U.S. to have? Mr. Perry, Mr. Williams, whoever wants to go ahead.
Sure. I think we should definitely be looking at upgrading our air defense. I think we're seeing, unfortunately, right now in Ukraine that modern military needs an ability to defend itself from a wide number of airborne threats, drones, missiles, rockets, and that we should be increasing our capacity in that area because we don't have nearly enough.
Well, we jettisoned defense. We jettisoned systematic air defense for the in Canada as part of our strategic downsizing. So this is actually a broader conversation about rebuilding air defense for the Canadian Armed Forces. We currently cannot provide for our own systematic air defense for our troops in Latvia. And so certainly in the current environment, that's a conversation to be had. But that will require significant commitments in terms of staff and some of resources. And it seems we're having trouble just getting the commitments that we've actually made to the Canadian Armed Forces over the line. And we've had those problems for years.
Yeah, I would argue, can you hear me okay? I would argue that the lack of a plan, which is what I referred to at the beginning, gets to the main issue. And I think Mr. Dwyer at the last meeting mentioned it too. We do not have, can you hear me okay?
Mr. Williams, could you just raise your mic up just a little bit? Could you raise your mic up a touch? Yeah, let's try it that way. A little bit higher, maybe a little bit higher.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
I think your question is not dissimilar from Mr. Jari's last week about the lack of information. The fact is that you do not have the tools that you need to show oversight. The question that you're asking, you ought to be able to go to a plan and that shows from a capital standpoint what we have and what we plan to get for the next few decades. We ought to have that. Other countries have that. Without that, nobody can do their oversight role appropriately. And if you marry that with performance measures, then you get the other side of the equation. How are things going that are being implemented in terms of delays and bottlenecks, and where are they, and who's to cause? That's the kind of information, basic information on what we have and what we need, that's not available. And if you want to get to the core of a question, why are we not as or why are we so inefficient? That's it. We're the only country that has diffused ministerial accountability. We have no way to measure what we're doing, and we have no plan about what we think we ought to do.
God bless you, Mr. Williams. I just had the very same conversation with Mr. McCauley last week. I said, what the hell's the point of all this if every time you ask a question about something, and I'm not trying to be combative with the government or with anybody that works inside of military or procurement, but every time you ask them about any of this, they say, oh, I can't tell you that. That's secret information. And Mr. McCauley informed me that in other countries, they're quite open about much of this, and you can find it right on their own websites. And so if anything comes out of this, and I don't care who the MPs are years from now, that should be one of them. How can you do your job as a member of parliament on a committee like this when you get stonewall every single chance you get, when they can't even tell you if they're planning on buying a Javelin or a Stinger or a Switchblade? Like, That should just be basic information. And the U.S. seems quite prepared to brag about everything they own and where they're going to send it, and we can't even tell anything. So enough about, sorry? Oh, Mr.
5 minutes
Kitchen.
goes
Mr.
by,
Kitchen.
like very quickly. And thank you, Mr. Lopp. We'll now go to Mrs. Thompson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know if I'll be quite as colorful, but I would like to begin by noting that certainly the multi-departmental approach to procurement has been in place for a long time. I think over 50 years, so it's quite an ingrained system. With that in mind, and Mr. Williams, to you, you have many ideas on defense procurement and how it can be improved. I'm interested to know if these discussions and suggestions were part of your work when you were an employee of the public service.
Thank you for the question, and yes, it was. And as you're aware, I had a book published on defense procurement, A View from the Inside, and I've been arguing for the last 15 years, like a broken record, that ministerial accountability will always lead to inefficiencies, lack of information, lack of monitoring. I don't know why we haven't fixed it. Maybe it's not a government priority, but until it is fixed, we're all going to be suffering from lack of information as we try to improve the process. So to me, it's not nuclear science, it's basic procurement. Without a forward-looking plan, without performance measures, and without being able to hold one minister accountable, don't expect improvements.
So let me ask you, how have you worked with government to put these ideas forward since you left the public service?
Well, I'm here today. I was at standing committees, over a number of years. I talk with ministers. I write about this. I talk about this ad nauseum for people, frankly. Some agree with me, some don't. But as I said in my opening comments, it was encouraging to see the government say, yes, that's a good idea in 2019. But apparently in 2021, it's not a good idea anymore. So I don't know, but I certainly have no idea why in this one area of the federal budget, you can't pinpoint one minister accountable for performance.
So, though there's much to do you feel that the defense procurement has been moving in the right direction?
No, it's not. And in fact, in an answer to a previous question, when I was there with my colleagues, not just me, we reduced the timeliness by 40%. 5 years later, it was in excess of what it was. So the process can work as long as you have people that know and understand and are committed to getting it through the system. But you shouldn't be depending totally on that. You should have clear accountabilities. Instead of simplifying accountabilities, we put in place all of these oversight committees, everyone checking everybody else until no one is accountable for anything. And that's how you get sloppy. If you want results, hold one person accountable, measure them, and if they're not good, change them. It's not all that complicated. That's how the real world works. It works everywhere, except frankly in defense procurement.
So let me ask you then, based on your conversation, to shift from this system that's been in place for a long time, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't move from it, but what I'm saying is to move to something more centralized. What is it specifically in the process that needs to be put in place to ensure that we don't move from one system that can become quite complex to another that has its own challenges based on a more defined process?
Well, in fact, in my book, I lay it all out. The legislative changes are minimal. This thing could be done easily within 1 year period of time. It's not a question of centralization. It's simply saying from now on, one organization with one minister is going to handle defense procurement. Take the resources from PSPC, take the resources from D&D, put them together. You'll save time, you'll save money, and hold that one minister accountable for getting results. As I said in my opening comments, that's how the rest of the world does it. It's not complicated, it's simplifying things, and that's how you get results. Hold that one minister to account. It's very simple.
I have to ask you, though, the ministers are not, it's election cycles, so by the very nature of political systems, people shift, and so having more narrow organizational movements and structures, would that not create a complication?
Not a complicated one. Throughout our history in the federal government, we've merged different departments easily enough. It's not the first time, it won't be the last. So to do it isn't a complication. I will say, though, that in departments, it could be perceived as a win-lose. So my comment has always been, unless the Prime Minister orders it to be done, it won't be done. Staff in PSPC, I'm sure, would much rather go to air shows in Le Bourget or Farnborough than worry about buying furniture for the Crown. People enjoy this, and I understand that. One minister may seem to be losing if they're not part of the big billion-dollar announcements. I understand that, and so I don't think it's going to happen from the bottom up. I think the Prime Minister has to order it if it's ever going to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. And with that, we have come to the end of our questions on the air defense procurement. So the doctor in me says everybody just stretch back for a second and do a quick stretch, as we don't have to bring in any witnesses, so we're all set. We have the same witnesses we have right now, and we will now go to the study of the National Shipbuilding Strategy. Just so that our witnesses are aware, the opening statements that you did provide us have been distributed to our members, so they do have them. Although we have agreed to allow you for up to 3 minutes, if you feel you need to just quickly touch on those, but we'll stick with the 3 minutes so we can abide by the times. And so, with that said, I will start again with Mr. Leprec. If you have 3 minutes.
Thanks for the opportunity again. So the NSS is emblematic of the extent to which defense procurement is highly politicized, especially by opposition parties looking to score points, and how politicians prioritize spending largesse to industry in targeted ridings over effective and efficient procurement. Challenges that plague air defense procurement and NSS are mere symptoms of a system that has to contend with vexing problems that are not of its making. Central agencies and Parliament have imposed procedures and controls that make it increasingly impossible for DND and the Canadian Armed Forces to deliver on the operational effects the governments and taxpayers are looking for. As long as opposition parliamentarians look to score political points by going after the Clerk of the Privy Council and others over jet fighters and shipbuilding, central agencies are going to exercise enhanced due diligence, which ensures that the pace of progress will be glacial and costs will escalate accordingly. As a result, procurement projects either end up in a death spiral or result in the military getting much less for the money spent than government could have gotten had projects stayed on track. The AOPS are a good example. The F-35, compare the estimated costs of the purchase that was announced with the original costing over a decade ago. A partial solution would be to make major votes on defense policy and expenditures all-party votes, as in Australia. Endorsement by all removes some of the incentive to politicize defense procurement. Similarly, is the aim to enable the Canadian Armed Forces to acquire the required kit in the most efficient manner possible, or to spread political largesse across the country? If the objective is the latter, then it is disingenuous for parliamentarians to promise the military that it will get the kit that it needs on time and on budget. Both jet fighters and shipbuilding are caught up in this. The problem is not the military improperly defining the requirements, but government trying to maximize return for industry in specific ridings.
Thank you, Mr. Leprec. We'll now go to Mr. Perry for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the members of the committee for the invitation to keep talking to you now about shipbuilding. I'll start off by saying that the 3 concerns I outlined earlier about air defense procurements apply to shipbuilding as well. Insufficient prioritization and both capacity and scheduling issues. To start with the first, broadly speaking, the National Shipbuilding Strategy had 2 objectives: rebuilding the domestic marine industry and building actual ships. To date, the first component of that equation seems to have received much more consistent government attention than the latter. If we want to see our ships built faster, their delivery needs to actually be prioritized more than it has been. Beyond this, the same general staffing shortfalls that are impacting other procurement projects are also hampering shipbuilding, but so too are two unique capacity issues. The availability of skilled labor in the marine sector, especially at a time when many of Canada's allies are undertaking comparable projects of their own, is an issue that needs to be rectified to ensure the success of Canada's fleet renewal. And at the same time, in the Government of Canada, the lack of specific subject matter expertise on shipbuilding continues to be a limiting factor. If we want our shipbuilding efforts to succeed, we need to start thinking about a national marine sector human resources strategy to address this collective problem. And lastly, all NSS projects have experienced scheduling difficulties, with most projects having failed to meet more than one major schedule milestone. The repeated inability to meet those project timelines suggests that we have a systemic problem that needs to be fixed with shipbuilding specifically. Beyond those general issues, though, shipbuilding projects would further benefit from two additional changes to the way that they are being managed. First, we continue to manage the National Shipbuilding Strategy and the projects in it as a series of individual Navy and Coast Guard projects, rather than as an interdependent program of work. As all of those projects have to move through physical construction at each yard more or less sequentially, decisions on one project inevitably impact on others. Similarly, making purchase and design decisions on a project by project or worse, ship by ship basis is precluding Canada from achieving commonality across its fleet or any cost efficiency we might gain by making bulk orders for systems and equipment. Canada would be better served by managing these projects as a collective program of work from the cabinet level on down into the bureaucracy. And second, to return to the issue of prioritizing the actual delivery of ships, the governance of the National Shipbuilding Strategy and our individual projects should be reevaluated. Given the significant cost escalation that occurs with shipbuilding projects, the enormous amount of money committed to our fleets, and their importance to the Navy and Coast Guard, we need a governance structure in place to ensure timely decision-making that can enable expeditious capability delivery. The current complicated web of multiple Canadian government departments and industry stakeholders, and in the case of the Canadian service combatant, the American government through its foreign military sales, could be better structured. It does not appear that the current arrangements bring these stakeholders together often enough at the right levels of seniority to ensure that the many, many tough decisions required to build new ships are taken fast enough or with sufficient consideration being given to the impacts on the entire program of work. Thank you.
To Mr. Williams, 3 minutes, please.
Thanks, and I'm glad that you've read the comments, because that'll save me a lot of time and, frankly, heartache. This program is going to cost $250 billion. People should realize that. It is financially incapable of being done the way we're doing it. Just about every tenet of proper procurement has been squandered and neglected and not followed. And the weight has gone up by 44%. The statement of requirements, rather than being finalized within the department, was left to industry to decide what they wanted to do. The government abdicated its accountability to the private sector, let ISI, Irving Ship, make all the decisions. What else can we expect when the prices continue to escalate, when we don't have proper oversight? This isn't complicated again. When you abandon basic principles of accountability and transparency, you get the kind of disaster we're in. And no one seems to be reacting to the full life cycle cost. We have about $240 billion over 30 years to buy and maintain stuff. This one project is larger than all of that, which is needed for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. I mean, people should be absolutely up in arms about this, but people are still talking about whether it's 60 billion or 56 billion or 77 billion, without understanding that only represents 30% of the costs. So I have explained this. There is no way in my mind this will ever be done. Someone is going to wake up and understand that it can't be done. And what I have recommended is, notwithstanding the huge overspending and costs, do 3 this way, and then do the right process the right way, including competing a shipyard for the other 12. Your cost will be cut between 1/2 to 1/3 of the current costs, and there's ample evidence to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. And now we'll go into questions, and we'll start with Mr. Paul Hoos for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that irrespective of political party, we all have the same interest. We want to do better The situation in Ukraine, the war, the NATO requests are a clear message. Even though if we had planned those meetings before all that is happening, we have clear demonstration of the fact that we have to be more effective. Mr. Williams, let me come back to the issue of having a dedicated department dedicated to military procurement. You mentioned that in your notes. Why in 2019, in the mandate letter to the Mr. C. John at the time, it was said that he had to work with the minister in charge of procurement. That was in 2019. In 2021, that disappeared from the mandate letter. Why did the government change its stance, whereas we felt it was a very good idea, and it goes in the same line as what you've just mentioned?
In
my opinion, there's a clear answer. It's a matter of political ideology. The more complicated you make procedures, the more complicated you make bureaucracy, as well as political accountability, the more difficult it will be to buy anything or even to finish the project. So I think that there is no will to spend money on defense or on major projects to provide things to the Air Force. It worked for some 20 years. There were some expenses in the 90s, but now we have nothing. So it's clear that we have difficulty responding to the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces. So you know that when you say that the problem is ideological, that is serious, particularly since the idea came from the government in place and then the turnaround 2 years after. So you feel that on the liberal side, well, I don't have a choice but to mention political parties. We are here for that as well, even though we want to resolve the problem. You feel that on the liberal side, at least up to a month before the Ukraine war, they had no intention to invest in defense. So that's serious. Thank you. On the other hand, we also talked about exceeding cost. When the shipbuilding strategy came up, it was to be more efficient. That was the solution, to say shipyards will be able to build, plan in advance, and move forward with the budget. But the downside, I think Mr. Williams talked about it. Now we have, we're exceeding costs, and there are cost overruns, and there's no control. We have the famous AOPs. The first 5, I think, were 400 million each, and then there was a sixth that was ordered, about 600 million. So additional cost, we don't know why. A total of 2.8 billion. Now we are hearing that it's now 4.3 billion. The only answer we are getting is that it's because of COVID. Is that not an example of abuse? Mr. Lopresh, one of the problems we have with defense procurements is the long duration of project. The longer the projects last, the more you have cost overruns. For the public, it's 6% per year normally, but for defense, it's about 12% overruns. So the longer the time it takes, the more expensive the projects. But essentially, I was in Halifax in 2018. There was when we know that we have to order 4 and then end up with 5 or 6, we will know that there will be overruns. But how do we explain that there are such overruns when there was a plan and there were initial orders made? I don't understand why. I think the taxpayers also do not understand this, that in defense procurement, they are the same problem everywhere. We are talking about increasing defense budgets what will be done? Money is going to be wasted instead of invested and having materials with the right cost. With the AOPS, for example, how do we have such increases whereas everything has been planned in advance?
Mr. Williams, who I'm sure he has some insights to offer on this. I have my own views, but I've said enough on this.
I'm not going, I obviously are speaking as someone with an experience in procurement and the bureaucracy. And my contention is that this program in particular suffered extraordinary incompetence. People devising the process as if they knew nothing about how procurement should work. This has nothing to do with politics. This is bureaucrats devising processes that are unworkable. This process started in 2012. This is now another decade. People don't understand the statement of the SOIQ of information and qualification came out in 2012. You know, the Americans are building a set of frigates. It took them 3 years to do the front end stuff and make their decision, and another 6 years or 5 years until they get their first one at a third the cost. Now, it may not turn out to be exactly a third the cost, but
Mr. Williams.
Gave us the pros.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. We'll now go to Mr. Baines for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses that are joining us here today. My first question is to Mr. Luprecht. 2 joint support ships have been commissioned as part of the National Shipbuilding Strategy to be built by Seaspan's Vancouver shipyards. And I know in your comments you talked about the various regions that have been chosen to build these ships, and this is important for me. My questions are coming from Richmond, British Columbia, and it's an important industry for our marine sector here in British Columbia. And I'm curious about your thoughts on capability, shipbuilding abilities of maybe Seaspan's Vancouver shipyards. I believe them to be of the best, among the best in the world. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's some elements that we knew the shipyard wouldn't be able to deliver that National Defence now has to build at Esquimalt in order to be able to deliver on some of these components. I don't want to comment on who is qualified or not, but there are always political trade-offs in the decisions that governments make when they award procurement contracts. And we live in a particularly large country, and we don't procure a lot of these things. And when we procure them, then we customize them. And so the Canadian Surface Combatant, we do a series of customizations. I think many of these customizations are prudent customizations for the particular needs that Canada has. But that's why I find Mr. Williams's comparison a little bit unfair, because the scale at which, for instance, the Americans build their ships, or the way, for instance, the French do naval procurement, is somewhat different from the way Canada does it. And we need to make sure that in the end, this is actually equipment that will serve Canadian interests and the needs of the Royal Canadian Navy. And that will always require some bespoke modifications, as we're seeing with the Canadian Surface Combatant, for instance.
Right, and then as we know with the pandemic, like, what are your thoughts on how much effect did the pandemic have on the construction of these ships?
I cannot judge to what extent individual companies were affected. But look, when we talk about defense procurement, we have to be able to do defense procurement potentially under very challenging circumstances. Imagine if we had to do this in a situation where Canada was at war or in an adversarial conflict with another country. And we can see now, when our allies are coming to us and asking, what are you going to contribute? Not only are our cupboards bare, we have processes that the Department of Commerce in the United States deems Canada among the most difficult and convoluted places in the world to do defense procurement. I think that is a badge of honor that we do not want to be wearing, and it means that federal governments are not in a position. I mean, a fundamental function of any government is to defend the country, defend the continent, and defend allies. And our procurement system is not able to deliver on those fundamental basic obligations that a government has for its citizens.
And if we were moving forward and like we were expecting the first ship to be delivered in 2023, let's say that we have the delivery of these ships, how do you think they'll contribute to the capability of the Navy and the Coast Guard?
Mr. Baines, you're asking an extremely important question, because I actually think the greatest challenge, regardless of what my colleagues have said, is not the actual equipment, it is the actual people. The greatest shortfalls currently that the Canadian Armed Forces have is with regards to specific trades related to the Canadian Navy. And so we can buy all the planes and ships we want, regardless of what the cost overruns of. If we can't provide the bespoke people for trades and occupations, if we can't provide the pilots, it doesn't matter what plane in the world. And I think we've put a lot of emphasis on procurement, but there are significant challenges. I'm testifying next week before the National Defence Committee on the recruitment and retention side. And the problem is, so armed forces have to do three things. They have to be able to regenerate, they have to be able to maintain and sustain themselves, and they have to be able to operate. And we have for years put so much emphasis on operations that we haven't been able to regenerate and maintain the force. And so now we are having significant challenges on the regeneration side, where it is going to compromise the ability of the Canadian Armed Forces to maintain and definitely to operate if we can't fix those regeneration issues. And I think there needs to be much more concerted emphasis on making sure the organization can actually regenerate itself in light of the significant challenges that it faces on regeneration.
Okay, and thank you for that. And do I have any more time?
40 seconds.
Just a little bit moving forward from just that question, maybe very quickly, the compatibility, if whatever systems are going to be implemented in these ships, how compatible are they with our allies and their systems?
Interoperability is absolutely critical, because Canada rarely, when it comes to international multinational operations, does things on its own. We always go places with allies, but our needs are also somewhat different from our allies. So for instance, French frigates are not designed to be able to stay at sea for, say, 6 months at a time. Given where we are located geostrategically, we need to be able to make sure that the equipment that we have can deliver on the specific Canadian needs that we have, that are nonetheless somewhat different than from those of several of our allies. So yes, interoperability, but also focusing on the particular Canadian contribution and how we have used national defense, I think, in a very politically savvy way over decades, as a force maximizer for Canadian foreign policy. And we need to understand, when we talk about national defense, we talk about the Canadian Armed Forces, we are talking about an instrument of foreign policy, and argument the single most important instrument of foreign policy that a federal government has at its disposal.
Thank you.
To Mrs. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Perry, Mr. Leprec, what would you say about the need for qualified workforce? We've been hearing a lot about that. In 1984, I was a student in Rimouski, the Maritime Institute in Rimouski. 1 minute. I'm sorry. I'm getting some feedback and I can't focus. I was a student in Rimouski in 1984, and the Rimouski Maritime Institute was overwhelmed. Students did not have enough space at the hostel, and they had to come to the CEGEP. And in 1984, the former Canadian Prime Minister carried out some cuts in the armed forces. I had some friends who were there. they heard the announcement that their positions were no longer required and that they could leave. And the Maritime Institute was emptied, more or less, and now they are looking for students, whereas before they were saying no to students. So in my humble opinion, what you are saying is true. There's serious work to be done with recruitment, particularly when it comes to training. That being said, Mr. Williams, something that struck me as well was when you said that it's industry that decides and not the client. So the government of Canada. I wonder about that because it would appear that normally when a client makes requests, industry tries to respond to those requests. When the client has questions, normally industry must respond and report to the client. What is now happening? Now that it's industry that is deciding, I would like you to give more information about that.
This issue is, in my experience, unique to the Canadian Service Combatant Project. Essentially, what the government did is it said, in order to build these ships, we're going to pre-select a yard where everybody is going to have to bid with. So they selected, in the case of the large combat ones, Irving. And that forced anybody that wanted to bid on this to work with Irving. So that in itself destroyed the typical way of doing business where you allow the consortiums to structure themselves and pick their own yard. Having done that, they made it worse by saying, now that Irving is going to be the yard, they are also going to be the company that's going to make these decisions on the statement of requirements, who the integrator will be, which design will be chosen. So they're the ones that picked the Type 26 design. That wasn't a proven design. They're the ones that chose Lockheed Martin. They're the ones that are deciding on the statement of requirements. No surprise, the costs have escalated from 26 billion to 77 billion. No surprise that the weight has gone up by 44%, because there are no constraints. There is no budget constraint. All of the basic controls that you typically see in a procurement program have been discarded. And we're now facing, I think, a very serious situation. How do we move forward? I don't think the government is ever going to sign a contract for 15 of these ships under the current rubric. Something is going to have to be done. And I made my suggestions how I think it should go forward.
Merci.
Thank you. Sir, are you worried to see that Lockheed Martin, and I'm not criticizing that company, I'm talking about the decision-making process. Are you worried to see that Lockheed Martin will be controlling the building of our aircrafts, and it's also fully involved with the design of vessels as well? Is that not a lot of control or decision-making in the hands of the same company instead of being in the hands of purely Canadian interest?
Well, let me separate the two. In fairness to the F-35, the government is in charge, not the private sector. Lockheed Martin is not in charge. The government selected that plane. It is the government and its officials that'll be monitoring the development of the program as it goes forward. I have no reason to suspect. Lockheed Martin is a well-reputed company, very, very capable. In this particular program, of course, they've already sold 700-800 of these. They're producing 3,400 in total, about 2,400 A versions. They're very capable and very competent. With regard to the ship program, however, it's not so much that I'm concerned about Lockheed Martin. I'm just concerned about Irving Shipbuilding and Lockheed Martin and BAE are able to sort of, without any budgetary constraints, take the taxpayer for a ride. I mean, this is unbelievable to me that we're going to be spending more than $250 billion, more money than we have to buy things for the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and no one is waving the red flags and screaming from the top of buildings. I don't understand how we've gotten this far without that being recognized. You can debate it, you can argue with me, you can say, I'm totally wrong, but this should be subject to huge scrutiny before it becomes too late.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. We'll
And
now
I'm not
go
wrong.
to Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go back to Mr. Williams. I really appreciate your comments. And, you talked about, the different things that are contributing to the cost of the Canadian surface combatants, immature ship design, costly developmental systems, allowing industry to modify and expand the statement of requirements, the lack of budgetary controls and devolving accountability for the procurement process to the private sector. Can you speak about what other countries are doing to ensure that they don't have this out of control costs, and maybe what extent should industry be able to contribute to the statement of requirements for large defense procurement projects?
Well, in my note, you will see that I make reference to the US FFG 62 frigate program, in which they did everything the way we ought to do things. They demanded a proven parent design, and the Type 26 was not even considered. You were non-compliant if you proposed that. They demanded off-the-shelf, highly developed systems. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be modified. Getting to Christian, everything is modified. You're not buying a Chevy off the car lot. So, but the degree of modifications is minimized, and then the integration risk is minimized. So they said, we want all these systems. We want a proven design. Here is the budget. Now go ahead, organize yourselves the way you want, and we will choose. And that whole process was launched and decided in a 3-year period between 2017 and 2020. That's how you do it. That's how we should have done it. And that's how we should do the next 12.
Hey, I've bought some lemons in my day, but I've never had a lemon come in 4, 5, 10 times the amount of money when I've driven it off the lot. So can you talk about maybe, the drawbacks in terms of the devolving accountability for procurements to the private sector, and speak about, like, you've been on the inside of this. What's changed since you were on the inside, where things have just gotten out of control here?
Well, I think so. I could never have imagined such obfuscation. And I'm going to say incompetence in terms of designing this kind of a process. There is no justification for it. I don't know how it ever got approved. And we're all paying the price right now for it. This thing started in 2012. It's mind-boggling. I talked at the beginning about the waste of time and money in conducting business this way. People have to, your committee has to be provided with more information in order to challenge and question bureaucrats that suggest that this is how we should be doing things. We select, systems that are highly developmental. We pick a frame that's highly developmental. We don't have any controls over everything. There's no transparency. There's no insight. I don't think anybody knows what's going on within the Irving, Lockheed Martin, BAE corridors. Nothing is open for us. We'll find out when the final design is set. But that's too late. That is too late. We should be challenging it and questioning it right now.
Thank you. Mr. Perry, you talked about capacity, and I was really appreciating that. I live in Port Alberni. We've got the only deep sea port on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They've been trying to get this big dry dock built on federal port lands. And the Transport Canada comes back and says, well, we don't have a program for floating dry docks. In the meantime, I was at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Conference, and they cited that there's about $3 billion a year in dry dock refurbishment done annually. And there's no dry dock space pretty much. It's all almost at capacity from Oregon to Alaska. Can you talk about how the procurement process is flawed, in that we can identify, and the PBO cited too, that because we haven't had a robust shipbuilding sector for years, costs are through the roof compared to other countries. Can you speak about the need for cross-departmental working collaboratively together to invest in opportunities to expand the shipbuilding sector?
So I think that part of the shipbuilding strategy about building a national asset, a national sovereign asset and source of supply shouldn't be lost here. I mean, one of your counterparts earlier asked about Canada buying javelins, and if we've seen with the conflict in Ukraine, what degree of national industry you have limits your options significantly in terms of what options are available to a government. We are in the process of building a national shipbuilding sector, which could build ships for us or other people potentially in the future. So I think that the government, we underplay the potential advantage to Canada in developing this exact type of industrial capacity. If we could take a quick moment to respond to some of the things that Alan has said. I mean, I agree with the part where he said people would have a different view about lots of that. I fully disagree with lots of aspects about how he's characterized the arrangement. But I totally agree about the lack of transparency and the fact that we should be able to argue about this based on an understanding and an articulation from government about how they think these arrangements for shipbuilding, for CSE, but more broadly, the relationship with the shipyards is supposed to work, including how the respective shipyards, particularly as we move to potentially 3 of them, about what status will exist between Canada and those shipyards, and how the relationships between the government and the yards and all the companies working below it are supposed to work, because I don't think we've heard enough of that articulated so far.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. You lost 5 seconds here. We're now into our final round, and we will go to Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thanks. Mr. Williams, thanks for incredibly depressing me. I do want to point out, I've got a copy of the Congressional Research Service. They've actually put out a report on the Constellation class, and actually shows the U.S. are quite heavily modifying the ship, make it quite a bit larger than the FREM parent, but still doing at about $1 billion a ship, so about 1/5 the cost that we're going to do. Mr. Perry and Mr. Williams, I just want to get your feedback just around the issues with the T-26. We've seen the reports of our Australian allies are struggling with it. Britain has pulled back from I believe, their commitment on how many they're actually going to do a few T-26 and a lot more of a smaller, less expensive frigate. When we had the Navy in last week, we spoke about this issue and the weight issues, and their comment was, well, maybe we'll scale back some of the, scale back parts of the ship in order to reach the weight and the speed requirements. And I'm going to express my horror the fact that we could be cutting back perhaps weaponry or other needed items on the ship to meet the originally stated, speed and other requirements from the RFP that the Navy seems to be perhaps willing to throw away items in order to achieve this weight. I wonder if you could both just kind of chime in on, our allies' experience with the T-26 design and what we are running into.
Well, let me just make a couple of comments.
Go ahead, Mr. Williams.
Thank you. A few comments. First, with regard to the American, they've only increased the length of their ship by 23.6 feet and only by 500 tons. That is, from a physical standpoint, that's relatively minor. And if you read the reports on it, they do not presume that there's going to be significant cost increases just because of that. Remember that their design is proven. All of the systems are off the shelf. With regard to the Type 26, I would just say take a quick look at what's going on in Australia, where in fact the weight increases has blossomed up. Apparently now they only have about 3% margin left. They've done a complete review. They've now delayed it by 18 months. The weight increase has, according to their audits, dramatically impacted on their power. They feel they've now lost range, they've lost speed, and they're going back to the drawing board in terms of design. They expect the delay will be 18 months in total. So I'm not
Mr. Williams, let me interrupt you quickly because I want to give Mr. Perry some time. But Do you think we're at that point where we're going to have to go back to the drawing board on our design? Because I asked the neighbors, like, we're way down the process, and we may have to throw it all out and start afresh.
Well, my recommendation in my notes is very clear. We should buy 3 of this kind. We've got economies of scale and we've got sunk costs of nearly $1 billion. Let's get 3 this way. At the same time, in parallel, we can do the process the right way and get a decision on another design potentially, but with costs more like what Fincantieri proposed and what the FFG 62 proposed, and still have deliveries in the same time frame that we're considering right now.
Right, Mr. Perry?
So I'd start by saying that I think it's important to keep in mind that that American program is still just at the theoretical or intent stage, and it hasn't actually delivered anything yet. With respect to the American Navy, its track record on delivering large surface ships on time and on budget isn't great, unless they've already made 3 or 4 or 5 dozen of them first, which is the case with the Arleigh Burke class destroyers. That's also an important consideration if you think about that Constellation class as a potential alternative for Canada, and that Canada does not have a plan to keep buying Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes like the United States does. We don't have aircraft carriers. So when making analogies to other programs elsewhere, it's important to try and understand the differences between what we're looking to do with our one program of acquisition versus what other countries are doing in acquiring multiple of them. I think there's actually a fair number of similarities, though, in terms of the basic approach that the Americans have taken and what we're doing. Some of those Congressional Research Service reports, as an example, point to them being inspired by the DNA of that ship, but they're extensively modifying it. As Mr. Williams pointed out, they're changing it along 3 dimensions, and they're also basically changing out all of the combat systems that go into it, which is really where the key real risk and the real integration challenges comes on a project like this. Canada's doing a version of the same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. We'll now go to Mr. Housefather for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all 3 witnesses. I think you've all been very informative, and I think you've brought out, Professor Luprecht in particular, the inherent tension that exists between different demands that are put on our procurement process. There's a desire to do things fast, but the faster you do things, then you don't do things competently and coherently and go through a rigorous assessment process. There's a desire to do things cheaply, but if you do things cheaply, then you can't be insisting on Canadian content and Canadian jobs being created and doing things here when you could buy something off the shelf from abroad more cheaply. And so a lot of the constraints that are being complained about today are ones that are actually being imposed on us by going through these models. For example, creating jobs in Canada. I'm sure there's a way of dealing with the ships in a way that wouldn't have created as many thousands of jobs in Canada, but would have procured off-the-shelf ships more quickly. I was just wondering, Professor Luprecht and Mr. Perry, if you could each perhaps comment on that, because I think that's what I'm most getting out of today.
I would say simply a short comment that I'm not as disenchanted with the NSS as Mr. Williams is. That I do actually think it provides perhaps better trade-offs on the Canadian benefits and the results that the Canadian Navy is going to get from it. And I would also like to point out, and I don't know if Mr. Williams disclosed that in his note, that of course he provides consultancy services that stand to benefit from the proposal that he's suggesting as an alternative. And he has been disenchanted with some of the acquisitions that have not benefited the companies for which he has been consulting. So that I'm not suggesting that this is what's motivating his interventions today. I would simply make sure that we also need to be aware of full disclosure.
That's not true.
Okay.
I can't allow that to stand.
That'll be up to the chairman.
That's an accusation.
Okay. Mr. Williams, I appreciate that, and I heard that, and I'm sure the chairman will give you time to respond, but I only have 5 minutes, and I don't want him to take it out of my time. If the chairman allows you to respond now without taking it out of my time, that's up to the chairman. Mr. Chairman?
Sorry, can you...
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Williams wanted to respond to something, but I do not want it to be part of my time. He wants to respond to something Professor Luprecht said. So I'm asking you if you're giving him the time outside of my 5 minutes.
So, Mr. Housefather, this is your 5 minutes, so you have the floor and can control, so depending on who you would like to answer. So, Mr. Housefather, you have the floor.
So Mr. Perry?
So I think the way that you framed that is bang on. I mean, shipbuilding in particular and a lot of aspects of procurement is essentially a series of trade-offs, making the least worst decisions, not ones that are inherently perfect. And that stretches across the entire continuum. Things like deciding who is going to be the prime contractor. There were lots of different models suggested, and there were different considerations, pluses and minuses involved in all of them. I think one thing, to go back to some of my opening comments, I think one thing where we've consistently seen is that we tend to sacrifice schedule and speed of delivery to satisfy other considerations, whatever they may be. And we need to think about ways that we can put more emphasis on sticking to schedule, because it has knock-on implications on a lot of other things, capability, affordability, and other aspects. But there's also ways that we can look to make more investments up front in human or physical infrastructure, as an example, to cite other things we've already talked about that could potentially accelerate those schedules. And I think we've unfortunately too often been penny wise, pound foolish. And we are in this. If we want to see it successfully delivered, then we should be looking to, as a country, make national level decisions to have this program of work move forward as expeditiously as we can make it.
Understood, and I agree completely with what you just said. And can I just come back to you on that? So for example, I think it's less a question of changing around the organizational structure as in making investments so that we have enough manpower to actually deal with all of the things we're asking to be dealt with, or organizationally changing it so not all of those things need to be dealt with, and we move faster in a more expeditious way. Would you say that that's more essentially correct?
I think that's definitely one way to look at it. I am not of the opinion that making an organizational structure change solves all these problems. A lot of them are competing priorities of government, and fundamentally you have to decide the order of precedence of those priorities. Just smushing everything together into one organization doesn't deconflict competing priorities. And we also have to keep in mind that we would be trying to do that kind of reorganization at, as far as I can tell, we are in the middle of the largest procurement program today, without anything future being added, we have been since the Korean War. And I think that there would absolutely be a cost of doing an organization like this as we are in the middle of a program that this overheated already. We may want to do that, but we need to, I think, have our eyes open about trade-offs involved in making that decision.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, do I have any time left?
Seconds.
Sorry, you cut out, sir.
You have 10 seconds.
Mr. Williams, if you want that to clarify, please go ahead.
Christian's comments were absolutely incorrect. I have no conflict of interest. I have no clients that are involved with the CSE. And for him to even suggest that is unconscionable.
Now we will go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I simply want to make a comment. In my former life, I was a teacher, and we had to plan everything from A to Z, forget nothing. And that included the cost of our activities. And when I look and listen to the various comments on both sides, there is no middle ground. Either we are going very fast, we buy elsewhere at low cost, or we go very slowly, and this involves higher costs. Without accountability. So we need to be transparent. I think there should be a middle ground, something more effective. We are talking about taxes, taxpayers' money, and not simply the interest of companies. We are talking about the money of taxpayers being used to defend their territory and territorial sovereignty. That is important. That being said, now we have 2 shipyards that are qualified. Should there have been a third sooner as part of the strategy for things to be better, for the procedure to be more fluid?
La question vous est ouverte.
The question is open to all of you.
So I'd start by saying that part of the justification for the announcement of adding a third shipyard 2.5 years ago was to increase the capacity available to deliver all of these ships to the Navy and the Coast Guard. I think additional capacity is still needed. There's an awful lot of work to do. There is a trade-off decision to make doing that, and that it'll complete all the work faster, which means that the long program of work that was originally envisioned for, in the beginning, one shipyard, and then it has turned out to be two, that work will get completed sooner if there isn't follow-on activity. But I think that adding that extra capacity to provide for icebreaking services at a time when we need to be more concerned, I think, than ever about the security and safety and defense of Canada through our Arctic, that I hope that see that decision come to fruition quickly. To your comment just about the extremes and finding a middle ground, I don't think there's really any options available to Canada where we can cheaply, quickly, and with no trade-offs go buy ships through another mechanism. I have enough confidence in government that if those easy routes existed, that we would have chosen to exercise them in the last 12 years. I think all things about this are tough. It's a question of which trade-off decisions you want to make and how you do your cost-benefit analysis, because there's no simple solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And if Mr. Williams or Mr. Luprecht would like to respond,
excuse one or the other. I think if you understand
excuse me, Mr. Williams,
please,
Mr. Williams, please, order.
Then,
Mr. Williams,
you can do things
Mr.
smartly
Williams,
and quickly.
Mr. Williams, order, please. Order. Mr. Williams and Mr. Luprecht, because of time restraints, we're not be able to follow. If you have a response to that question, I'd ask that you respond in writing and provide that to the clerk, and the clerk will distribute that throughout the committee. We will now go to Mr. Johns for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Perry, can you talk about how the shipbuilding industry has been affected by supply chains issues and global inflation, especially, the restart of the global economic engine, from COVID?
Shipping everything takes more time and is much more expensive, and that cascades through the entire supply chain for any industry, including shipbuilding. Anytime you have to move things from overseas, you're dealing with higher prices, and I don't think we yet fully understand how consequential the impact of inflation, which in the consumer economy is at a 30 whatever year high, is if you apply it to shipbuilding. But beyond that, though, the things like just the inefficiency in conducting these hearings like this rather than in person, that's manifested itself over the last 2 years in shipbuilding and all other forms of procurement. We have been managing these from the Government of Canada side through Teams meetings, which I think quite simply are nowhere near as efficient as meeting in person. And I don't think we really fully understand, but there's definitely an impact of having done that for the last 24 months.
That's great feedback. In terms of, back to my question earlier around capacity, the government doesn't really have a strategy around expanding and building capacity. Small rural communities like Port Alberni, we've got a good company, Canadian Marine Engineering, that wants to grow the shipbuilding sector that they know would help support demand. The PBO cited that if there's more shipyards, the cost will come down, especially in rural communities like Port Alberni, where the cost of living is much lower than Vancouver, Montreal, Halifax. Can you speak about the importance of policy as well? There was a 25% tariff, that discouraged companies from building ferries outside of Canada, and then the government got rid of that. That money could have been building floating dry dock space. Can you speak about the importance of both policy and critical investments in these areas?
So I think we do need to try and get better alignment, both in terms of the policy framework as well as infrastructure investments. I think there are a number of opportunities where we can choose to invest more money in some of this essentially national infrastructure with the same kind of logic about making other wider societal infrastructure investments applies here. If you can spend $1 billion now, that'll have a $2 billion impact over 30 years. To me, that's something that's worth considering. And in terms of accessing that wider human talent pool, if you go to more facilities, there's a trade-off in efficiency and project management you'd have to weigh. But I think certainly the existing shipyards don't have enough staff, either on the blue or white collar sides. As we move to a third shipyard with a whole nother basket of projects, that's only going to get exacerbated. And that's fundamentally Canada's problem to address, irrespective of which shipyard employs people.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And Mr. Johns, you got your 6 seconds back on that. We'll now go to Mr. Lobb for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. The first thing is I just want to check in with Mr. Williams here. I didn't know if he got all his final say in or if he had anything else he wanted to say, because I think it was maybe left unsaid from Mr. Housefather's round there.
I'm trying to remember the comments from Mr. Housefather, so I'll just let it be for the moment.
Took exception, I think, to one of the other witnesses' comments. You said you couldn't let it stand or something like that, so I was just wondering if...
Oh, yes. Well, absolutely. It was suggested that somehow my comments are tainted because I'm in a conflict of interest with companies that are interested in one shape or other in the CSC program. And that is absolutely unequivocally not true. I'm not working for, paid by, involved with any other company. And I purposely made sure, both on this file and on the JET file, not to ever be involved with any of the companies so I can voice my views without any conflict of interest or any allegations of such. So I just wanted to make that absolutely clear.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Perry, do you have any comments? You want to make any further comments on transparency?
I do. I mean, to go back to Alan's point about the immense costs of this, whatever the right number is, they are huge. And I think that we have not been well served by the amount and frequency of transparent communication about what's been happening on these shipbuilding projects over the last decade. It's waxed and waned, but I think it's at a bit of a low point right now. We shouldn't be relying on hearings like this as the key mechanism to learn what's happening on an investment of this immense volume of money. I think it's too important to be left to this infrequent series of communications. There was a previous minister of PSPC that had suggested making quarterly shipbuilding reports. I'm sure that'll terrify bureaucrats, but I think that given how much money is at stake, that kind of a tempo would better serve Canadians to make sure that we actually know what's happening, why decisions are being made, where costs are, when we're going to get ships.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Mr. Perry. And I think that would certainly serve parliamentarians and taxpayers very well to have that. We discussed some of the other countries that are doing a better job on well, obviously the Americans do a better job in transparency than us. Australia, I think you mentioned Switzerland. You know, what are they doing in their procurement process that depoliticizes the purchasing process, like seems to delay and kill projects here?
So I think there's several factors, but I think part of the transparency is part of that, being able to better explain what's actually happening. So you can have a discussion that's based on a much larger basis of facts that's available, I would suggest to you, compared to some of your counterparts in other jurisdictions. Our governments, whatever the political stripe, I don't think do a good enough job at getting enough of that information out consistently. And we're investing way too much money to not be clearer with all Canadians, but especially parliamentarians, about what decisions we're making, why we're making them, and what the implications are.
You mentioned that because I remember actually in this committee several times bringing up the fact that the parliamentary budget officer had to go down to the U.S. to meet with the Pentagon to get costing on frigates so they could bring them back here and extrapolate them for our program because D&D was refusing to release information. So here we have the U.S. being more open on our costs than our own Defense Department. Is it a lack of political will? Does it require the new Defense Minister to say, get it together and be transparent? Or is it, you know, stuck with red tape in the bureaucracy? Like, where is this coming from? Or is it just baked into our system?
I think part of it is baked in, and there's not a lot of enthusiasm, I don't think, across the official level and in the public service. I mean, fundamentally, a lot of this reporting ends up being a lot more work. And that, you know, if you have a choice between actually making decisions and reporting on them, there's an understandable tension between doing the work and telling people what you've done. But I do think that we can strike a better balance. And I don't think that you can expect any change unless it does come from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on down.
It goes back to the original comment about everything being de-risking. And I think our bureaucrats are, part of their de-risking is blocking information to parliamentarians and taxpayers. So thanks very much for that.
Got 10 seconds.
Okay.
I will give my 10 seconds to PTH.
Merci, le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. I would like a written question, a written answer. The government is announcing investments in Cold Lake and Bagotville for a fighter aircraft. Can that investment be done without really knowing the model that will be finally chosen? Mr. Perry or Loprech, you could send us your response in writing.
Paul Hoos, and so if the witnesses could respond to that in writing, I'd appreciate that. And if you need clarification on that question, we'll get it transcribed so that you can have that as well. We'll now go to Mr. Johari for the last round of questions, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go and pick up where my colleague MP Baines left on his conversation. I think, Mr. Leprecht, you were responding to him when you talked about the customization, and you specifically highlighted the fact that the need of our country and the need of our fleet is very different than others that we are comparing this cost with. And then we kind of went into the interoperability and how important it is that we be able to fit within the NATO. I'd like to go back to you, sir, and ask about what this customization are specifically are that's unique to us. What's the impact on the overall cost, and how does it fit within that interoperability that's needed within the NATO?
So I'll give you one example that since Canada is far away from other parts of the world, when we send a frigate somewhere, we might need that frigate to be able to be more or less self-sufficient for, say, 6 months at a time. And so that has implications for how you set up your ship as compared to, for instance, what French frigates do, which are designed to stay to operate independently for a much shorter period of time. And so these are considerations that will necessarily affect the design of a ship. Or you might think, for instance, of what radar system you might want to put on a ship, to what extent you might then deploy that ship to support efforts for missile defense, for instance, by allied countries. So these are all particular considerations that have both military components as well as political components. And that's why I say it is an instrument of foreign policy. And if we don't equip the ships with that in mind, that might mean that we might have nice frigates that can ultimately not perform the requirements that taxpayers and the government of the day might have in terms of deployment expectations.
So thank you. So the way I take it is that off the shelf is a good idea, but when we look at our geographical situation where we are in the world and what role we want to play and what we need to be able to defend ourselves, some of these customization and some of these functionalities is justified. Is that a fair statement?
That we certainly want to make sure that we have equipment that delivers for Canada and Canadian interests, both in terms of Canadian industry as well as national interest abroad. And I think for any military, that means that's going to require some customization, but in particular for Canada, because our situation is nonetheless quite different from that of the United States, quite different from most of our European allies, and also somewhat different from Australia, where I lived for some time. And so I think it is prudent to make sure we take those into consideration. The trade-offs are, of course, as Mr. Williams points out, a matter of appropriate oversight throughout the process, and as Mr. Perry points out, appropriate accountability to the taxpayer to ensure we can explain the trade-offs that we are making.
Thank you, and I want to close on the topic of interoperability. So, can you help us, demystify this interoperability when it comes to our ships, not only defending us and defending us on the north, but also being part of the NATO?
Let me provide a simple example to you. Often what Canada will do is it may decide to substitute a Canadian frigate for a U.S. frigate in an American aircraft flotilla, for instance. That means the Americans can now pull their frigate out and deploy it somewhere on an operation where Canada might decide for political or other reasons it has no interest to deploy a Canadian frigate, but it frees up American resources, which then makes Canada a vital partner for the United States in providing for multilateral and allied defense. And it also, and the Americans like working with Canada precisely because they can trust Canada and they can trust Canadian equipment insofar as we are fully operable, especially on the naval side, where this is absolutely vital in terms of maximizing our overall impact. And that, of course, then also then gets us good visibility in Washington, because if you're able to support the United States in areas that might be of mutual national interest for Canada, that scores us points in Washington that then allows us to advance other policy files that are of equal importance in our bilateral relationship.
Just Nora, thank you.
Good job, man. Thank you to everybody, and I want to thank the witnesses for bearing with us. We started at 3:48, unfortunately, due to the votes and a few delays, and we know that you were with us even before that time frame when you signed in early. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for bearing with us, because we went through a full 2 hours as well, so it's greatly appreciated. So Mr. Leprec, Mr. Perry, and Mr. Williams, thank you very much for being with us throughout this time frame. And if you do, as I've mentioned earlier, if you do have anything that you feel that you need to submit in writing, please do so. It'd greatly appreciated. With that said, I would like to thank the interpreters and the technicians for also staying with us as we went through this, as well as our analyst and our clerk for being with us throughout this time. So with that said, I declare the meeting adjourned.